A Luna who cannot give me an heir is no Luna at all." Those were the first words Seraphine Vane heard when she stepped into the great hall of Ravenmoor, and they hit her spine like a blade, sliding between two vertebrae, cold and precise and final. Her husband, Calen Thorne, the Alpha King of the Nightfell territories, stood at the head of the assembled court, with his hand resting on the swollen belly of another woman, and he was smiling. Not the grim, tired smile she had spent 3 years learning to coax out of him. A radiant one. A proud one. The kind of smile she had begged the moon for and never once received. The mate bond that had bound them since the night he first spoke her name flared white-hot in her chest, and then, as she watched his palm curve tenderly over Vivian's stomach, it began to tear. She felt it the way you feel a tendon snap, a wet interior severing that no one else in the room could see, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, as though she could hold the two ragged ends of herself together by sheer will. Blood roared in her ears. The gilded torches doubled and swam. Somewhere very far away, the court was applauding. She did not scream. That was the first decision, and she made it in the space of a single indrawn breath, before grief had even finished announcing itself. She had learned long ago that in the House of Wolves, a scream is a confession of weakness, and weakness in Ravenmoor was harvested like grain. So she stood in the archway, with the rain still dripping from the hem of her travelling cloak. She had ridden 2 days through the northern passes to bring him word that the border clans had finally agreed to peace. The peace she had negotiated alone, kneeling in the mud of a dozen contested valleys, and she let the applause wash over her like cold surf, and she looked at the woman beside her husband, Vivian Ashcroft, her friend. Her only friend in this whole vast marble mausoleum of a palace, the woman who had wept on her shoulder about a cruel father, who had braided Seraphine's hair the morning of her coronation, who had whispered, "You are the sister I never had," into the dark. Vivienne would not meet her eyes now. She looked at the floor, at the king, at her own belly, anywhere but at the woman she had ruined. And in that averted gaze, Seraphine read the entire shape of the betrayal, its careful architecture, the months of it, and understood that she had been the last person in the kingdom to know. "There she is," Calen said, and his voice carried that easy authority that had once made her feel chosen. He had seen her at last. The court turned, a single rustling animal of silk and fur and jewels, and 200 faces found her in the doorway and arranged themselves into pity, into contempt, into the awful gentleness people reserve for the newly discarded. Seraphine, good. You should hear this from me directly, before the criers spread it. He did not release Vivienne. That was the cruelty inside the cruelty, that he kept his hand on the other woman while he addressed his wife as if Seraphine were already a stranger, a petitioner, a ghost who had wandered in from the storm. "Vivienne carries my child, my heir. The moon has finally answered, and it did not answer through you." He said it plainly, coldly, the way a man reports the weather or the price of grain. "You have served the crown faithfully. No one will say otherwise. But a barren Luna is a wound the pack cannot afford, and I have a duty older than any vow I made to you." Duty. He used the word like a shield, and behind it his eyes were already elsewhere, already counting the future. Seraphine felt the last thread of the bond fray down to a single filament, and she thought, absurdly, of the night 3 winters ago when he had come to her fevered with silver poisoning after the raid on the Greywater Ford, and how she had sat awake beside him, for 6 days, pressing wolfsbane compresses to the black, spreading wound, and how on the 7th night his fever broke, and he wept into her lap and swore he would never leave her side. She had believed him. She had built her entire self around that belief, brick by brick, until there was nothing of the girl she had been before, only the Luna, only the wife, only the woman who mended what the crown broke. And now he was telling her, in front of the whole court, that the moon had corrected his mistake. "How far along?" she said. It was not the question anyone expected, least of all her, and it came out flat and steady, a physician's question, and the hall went very quiet. Kaelin frowned, thrown by her calm. 4 months, he said. 4 months. She did the arithmetic without wanting to, the way a wound counts its own heartbeats. 4 months ago she had been in the eastern marches for the entire season, brokering the grain treaty that had kept 3,000 of his people from starving through the frost. 4 months ago she had trusted him with her absence. 4 months ago her best friend had been in this palace, in these halls, and Seraphine had written her long letters by candlelight and signed them, "Your loving sister." She looked at Vivienne one final time and watched a single tear track down the beautiful, treacherous face, and she felt not one grain of pity, only a great and terrible clarity settling over her like the first snow of the year, silencing everything. "Then congratulations are in order," Seraphine said. Her voice did not shake. She would examine, much later, in a warm room in a distant country, how it was that her voice didn't shake. Long life to the heir of Nightfell. And she inclined her head, the perfect measured bow of a Luna to her king, and she turned and walked back out into the rain, and the great doors closed behind her, and not one person in that hall of 200 souls understood that they had just watched their kingdom lose the only thing keeping it alive. Because Seraphine Vane didn't weep in the corridor. She didn't sink to the flagstones. She walked, straight-backed and dry-eyed, past the tapestries she had commissioned, and the library she had built, and the infirmary she had staffed, and with every step a single sentence assembled itself behind her ribs, cold and whole and unbreakable, the vow that would become the spine of everything that followed. "You will announce a child today, and by this time next year you will be begging me for one." And then she began, very quietly, to plan. She did not go to her chambers. That was the second decision, and it was the one that saved her. Her chambers would be watched now. A discarded Luna was a liability, and Kaelin was a man who tidied his liabilities. Instead, she went down into the servants' passages that veined the palace like a second nervous system, the narrow stone throats where she had spent more hours than in any throne room, because it was in these passages that the true work of the kingdom happened, and it was here that she had, over 3 careful years, made her only real friends. The rain had soaked her to the skin, and she was shivering, but the cold felt clean, felt like waking. At the bottom of the western stair, in the low, warm room where the palace laundry steamed and dried, an old woman was waiting for her, because the old woman was always waiting, because she had heard the criers before the court had even dispersed. Odessa Brine had been a servant in Ravenmoor for 51 years. She had bathed Kaelin as an infant and buried 2 kings, and she had eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that told no one, and she had loved Seraphine from the first week, when the new young Luna had come down into the servants' hall to learn the names of the people who fed her, rather than dine alone at the high table. "So," Odessa said, and set down the sheet she was folding. "It's done, then. The fool has done it." "It's done," Seraphine said, and only now, in the presence of the one person in this palace who had never wanted anything from her, did her hands begin to shake. Odessa crossed the room and took them in her own, which were cracked and strong and smelled of lye and lavender. "Listen to me, child," the old woman said, low and fierce. "There is not much time. He'll be gentle tonight, magnanimous. He'll offer you a cottage in the western woods and a small allowance and your freedom, and he'll expect you to be grateful. And that's the trap. The moment you accept his charity, you belong to him forever. A pensioner, a ghost he can summon and dismiss. You must be gone before he can be generous. Gone tonight, before sunrise. Do you understand?" And Seraphine, who had spent 3 years being told what a Luna could not do, felt something unlock in her chest, because for the first time in a long time, someone was telling her to run, and meaning it as a gift. "I have somewhere to go," Seraphine said, and it was true, and the truth of it was the thing she had never told a living soul, not even Odessa, not even the moon, because Seraphine Vane had not come to Caelin as a nobody. She had come as the last surviving daughter of the Vane line, a family of physicians and scholars from the far southern reaches, a family that had once, generations back, held its own small territory before the wolf plague, and the wars scattered them. Her father had died when she was 17 and left her nothing anyone thought was worth having: a leather satchel of medical texts, a signet ring she never wore, and a deed. A deed to a ruined estate on the coast of the Meridian provinces, a crumbling manor called Saltmere that everyone assumed was worthless, sitting on cliffs above a dead harbour in a land that had forgotten it. She had never spoken of it, never used it, had kept the deed sewn into the lining of the very cloak she was wearing now, because some deep animal part of her, some part that had been watching Caelin's easy charm from the very first night, had always known that a woman should keep one door in the world that only she has the key to. She had married a king and told him she owned nothing. It had been the smartest lie of her life. "Then the coin," Odessa said, and here the old woman did something extraordinary. She went to the great copper cauldron where the palace sheets were boiled, reached into a gap between 2 floor stones that Seraphine had never noticed, and drew out an oilcloth bundle heavy with the dull music of gold. 3 years, Odessa said, unwrapping it. Every coin you ever pressed into a servant's hand for a kindness, every gift you gave that we couldn't refuse and couldn't spend on ourselves, we kept it. All of us. We knew this day would come. We knew it the moment that Ashcroft girl started walking the upper halls after dark. We've been saving your own generosity to give back to you when you'd need it most. Seraphine stared at the gold, and then at the ring of faces that had gathered soundlessly in the doorways of the laundry. The kitchen boys, the stable hands, the seamstresses, the whole invisible kingdom beneath the kingdom, and understood that while she had been building the palace's peace, they had been building her escape, and she pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes and let herself weep for exactly 10 seconds. And then she stopped, and she wiped her face, and she began to give orders like the queen she had never quite been allowed to be. The horse was ready in an hour, a plain brown gelding from the outermost stable, saddled by a boy named Fen, whose fever Seraphine had broken 2 winters past. She changed out of the sodden Luna's cloak and into rough travelling wool, and she took nothing that Caelin had given her, not the sapphire circlet, not the moonsteel wedding band, not the fur-lined boots. She left the wedding band on the pillow of the chamber she would never enter again, laid in the exact centre of the cold linen, a small, perfect circle of severed vow, and she left the circlet beside it, and she left a single sheet of paper on which she had written nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that silence would not say better. She took only what was hers before him: the satchel of her father's medical texts, the signet ring, the deed, and the gold that her own kindness had earned. At the postern gate, Odessa held the bridle while Seraphine mounted, and the two women looked at each other in the blue-black hour before dawn, and neither of them said goodbye, because neither of them believed it was one. "Become something they can't ignore," Odessa said. "And when you do, when you rise so high the whole north has to look up to see you, don't come back for revenge. Come back for the reckoning. There's a difference, and you'll know it when the time comes." Seraphine nodded. She did not trust her voice. She turned the gelding south, toward the sea, toward the ruin that was hers alone, and she rode out under the last stars while the palace slept, and behind her the great black bulk of Ravenmoor sank slowly beneath the horizon like a stone dropped into deep water, and she did not look back, not once. And by the time the sun cracked the eastern sky and the criers went out to announce the coming heir, the Luna of Nightfell was 30 miles gone and still riding, and no one in that whole gilded kingdom knew what it had lost until it was far, far too late to call her home. 6 months is a long time in a life that has been set on fire. It is long enough for a woman to ride to the edge of the known map and past it, to trade a king's palace for a dead man's ruin, to learn which of her hands could build and which could only mend. Seraphine reached Saltmere on the 9th day of hard travel, and what she found nearly broke the little that Ravenmoor had left whole. The manor stood exactly where the deed had promised, on a high grey cliff above a harbour choked with rotting boats, its roof half collapsed, its windows blind, gulls nesting in the great hall where her ancestors had once received ships from across the sea. The town below it, the little port called Rackford, was dying the slow death of forgotten places, its fishing fleet halved by a sickness in the water, its people gaunt and suspicious, its one healer dead the previous spring and no one to replace him. A wolf without a pack, arriving alone on a spent horse, was met at the town well by a wall of folded arms and hard eyes. They took her for a bandit, a spy, a runaway noblewoman come to lord her ruin over them, and perhaps she was all three. But on her second morning in Rackford, a fisherman's daughter went into a birth that had turned wrong, breech and bleeding, and the midwife was 3 villages away, and the child was dying, and someone remembered the strange woman up at the ruin with the satchel of books. They came for her at a run. Seraphine walked into that low, dark cottage, still wearing the dust of her exile, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she did what the daughter of physicians is bred to do. She turned the child. She stopped the bleeding. She placed a living son in a mother's arms as the sun came up, and when she stepped back out into the salt air, the fisherman was on his knees in the mud, and the wall of folded arms had become a crowd of open hands. That was the beginning. Not the manor came later, but the trust, which is the only foundation worth building on. Seraphine did not tell them she had been a queen. She told them her name was Sarah, and that she was a healer, and that she had come to stay, and she let her work speak the rest. She set the fisherman's daughter's son as her first patient, and by the end of the month she had 40. She lanced fevers and set bones and delivered babies and sat with the dying, and she took payment in fish and firewood and labour, because the town had no coin, and slowly, one repaired roof beam at a time, the men of Rackford began to climb the cliff and put Saltmere back together, not because she asked, but because she had earned it. But Seraphine had not survived Ravenmoor to become a village healer, however good, and the same cold clarity that had walked her out of that great hall was already turning, in the long nights, toward a larger design. Because in her weeks of listening at bedsides and washing wounds, she had learned the true sickness of Rackford, and it was not in the people. It was in the water. The harbour's dying fleet, the fish blooming with sores, the children with the wasting cough. She had traced it, with her father's books open on her knee. to a slow poison leaching from the old silver mines in the hills above the town, mines that had been sealed a generation ago and had begun, with the collapse of an inland dam, to bleed their tailings into the very springs that fed the port. She understood it because she had spent 3 years treating silver poisoning in wolves. She understood it because she had once nursed a king through it. And she understood, standing on her cliff with the sick sea below her, that if she could cure a harbour, she could resurrect a town, and if she could resurrect a town, she could build a power that answered to no king and no crown and no mate bond ever again. She wrote letters. This was the second thing Seraphine understood, that the men who had discarded her never would. That the true machinery of the world is not force, but correspondence, the patient laying of 100 small obligations until they knit into a net strong enough to hold a kingdom. She wrote to the scattered remnants of the Vane line, distant cousins in the southern cities who had thought the name extinct, and she offered them a foothold in a reviving port. She wrote to the Guild of Engineers in the free city of Halloway, and traded them her father's rare treatise on hydraulics for a survey of the poisoned dam. She wrote to the physicians she had trained in Ravenmoor's infirmary, quietly, and 3 of them came south to join her, glad to escape a palace that had grown cruel. And she wrote, most importantly, to a man named Cassian Rourke. He was the harbour master of Halloway, the largest free port on the Meridian coast, a broad, plain-spoken man of no noble blood who had built the busiest harbour in the south from nothing but competence and nerve, and he owed no allegiance to any Alpha King because his city had thrown off its last one within his own lifetime. Seraphine wrote to him, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. I have a dead harbour, a proven cause, and a plan to cure it. You have ships that will need a northern port when the sea lanes shift, as they are shifting. I propose a partnership. She did not mention that she had been a queen. She let the letter's competence speak exactly as her healing had, and 3 weeks later, Cassian Rourke rode into Rackford with a train of engineers and a hold full of tools and a look on his face like a man who had come expecting a madwoman and found a strategist instead. They worked well together from the first hour, and it unsettled her how easy it was, because she had forgotten that a working partnership could feel like anything other than a leash. Cassian respected exactly one thing, and it was capability, and Seraphine had it in a measure that made his eyebrows climb. He did not flatter her. He did not touch her. He argued with her about drainage gradients and the price of copper piping, and won half the arguments, and lost the other half with good grace. And when they diverted the poisoned outflow of the old dam into a sealed cistern, and ran the town's springs through beds of charcoal and clean gravel, and the water ran clear for the first time in a decade, he did not congratulate himself. He looked at her across the churning new channel and said simply, "You could have run one of the great cities of the south, you know. What are you doing hiding on a cliff in Rackford?" And Seraphine, watching the clean water pour down toward the harbour that would within a year begin to teem with fish again, said only, "Building something no one can take from me." He heard the whole story in that sentence, or enough of it, and he had the grace not to ask, and that grace was the thing that told her he was safe. By the turning of the season, the harbour of Rackford was clean, its fleet returning, its coughing children healed, and word of the woman who had cured a dying port was spreading up the coast faster than any crier could carry it. They called her the Saltmere Healer. They called her the woman who bought a ruin and raised a town. And in the far north, in a palace beginning to smell of rot, no one had yet connected that name to the Luna who had walked out into the rain and vanished. But Seraphine had not stopped listening, and the North was talking. Cassian's ships called at every port on the coast, and his captains brought her news the way her patients had once brought her fish. And the news from Nightfell was, at first, a small dark satisfaction, and then, as the months turned, something closer to prophecy fulfilled. Because Calen Thorne's kingdom was dying, and it was dying of the exact wound Seraphine had spent 3 years preventing. She had been the one who held the border clans in peace. Within 4 months of her leaving, the peace had collapsed, and the northern valleys were burning again. She had been the one who negotiated the grain treaties. The eastern marches, insulted by the abrupt cruelty with which the crown had discarded a Luna they had come to trust, had closed their granaries, and Ravenmoor was rationing bread. She had been the one who ran the infirmary and the treasury's charitable accounts and the whole invisible apparatus of a functioning court, and Calen, dazzled by his new heir and his new woman, had not understood that a kingdom is not held by its king, but by the 1,000 competencies of the person standing in his shadow, and he had banished his own competence into the rain. Vivian, it turned out, could not govern. Vivian could wear the circlet and host the feasts and preen at the high table, but Vivian did not know the names of the servants, or the balances of the granaries, or the temper of the border lords, and the court that had applauded her ascension began, quarter by quarter, to curdle. "They're calling it the barren year," one of Cassian's captains told Seraphine over a chart-strewn table, not knowing what the words meant to her. The North, I mean. Bad harvests, worse politics, and a king who spends his days at his mistress's bedside while the granaries go empty. There's talk the old lords are looking for a reason to break from him. Seraphine listened, and filed it, and felt the cold clarity in her chest arrange the new intelligence into the slow shape of a plan, and she declined, that night and every night, the cheap and easy pleasure of gloating, because Odessa had taught her the difference between revenge and reckoning takes patience, and she had all the patience in the world. There was one more piece of news, and it was the one that changed the game from a private grief into something far larger, and it came not from a ship's captain, but from a letter that arrived at Saltmere on the coldest night of the winter, carried by a rider who had killed 2 horses to bring it, sealed with a mark Seraphine had not seen in 3 years, the lye and lavender sigil that Odessa Brine used to close the notes she had once slipped beneath a lonely Luna's door. Seraphine broke the seal with hands that would not stay steady, and read, and the room went very cold around her, colder than the winter outside, because the old woman's cramped and urgent hand told her a thing that turned the whole betrayal inside out. Vivian Ashcroft had not seduced a king out of ambition or love. Vivian Ashcroft had been placed. Her father, Lord Malrek Ashcroft, master of the Western Silver Holdings, the same silver, Seraphine realized with a lurch, that ran in poisoned veins through half the northern hills, had spent years maneuvering his daughter into the king's bed for a single purpose, to put a child of Ashcroft blood on the throne of Nightfell, and then to remove the king who had served his purpose. Odessa had overheard it herself, hidden in a servant's passage, Malrek's voice cold and precise. The Thorn line ends with this pregnancy. My grandchild rules, and I rule the grandchild, and the wolves of the north will finally answer to the men who own the ground beneath their feet. The Luna was the only one clever enough to see it coming, and the fool sent her away himself. He did our work for us. Seraphine set the letter down on the table, where she and Cassian planned the resurrection of harbors, and she understood, at last, the full architecture of the thing that had been done to her. She had not been betrayed by a faithless husband and a jealous friend. She had been removed, surgically, by a predator who had been playing a longer game than any of them, a game in which Kaelin was not the villain, but the next victim, and a game whose final move, the murder of a king and the seizure of a throne, had not yet been played. And Seraphine Vane, the discarded Luna, the Saltmere healer, the woman who had built a power on a cliff above the sea, folded the letter and looked out at the dark water and felt the cold clarity crystallize into something with edges, because now it was not only her wound that demanded reckoning. Now there was a kingdom to save from the very trap she had escaped, and she was the only person alive who could see the whole board. Winter broke into a hard, bright spring, and Seraphine spent it becoming, quietly and deliberately, one of the most powerful people on the Meridian coast, though she never once raised her voice to do it. The harbour of Rackford was thriving now. Cassian's ships came weekly, and the Vane cousins had established a trading house in the rebuilt town, and the estate of Saltmere, its roof mended and its great hall glassed and warm, had become something the region had never had before. A centre. Physicians trained there. Engineers consulted there. The letters that flowed out of it wove the scattered free ports of the south into a loose federation of mutual interest that answered to no crown, and at the centre of that web sat a woman who had learned the true nature of power the hard way, that it is not the crown, but the network, not the throne, but the 1,000 obligations, not the roar of the alpha, but the quiet indispensability of the one who makes everything work. She had money now, real money, the kind that moves fleets. She had allies who owed her their harbours and their children's lives. And she had, in Cassian Rourke, something she had stopped believing existed, a partnership of equals, a man who saw her competence and was not threatened by it, but delighted, who had somewhere across the long months of clean water and reviving trade become the person she told things to at the end of a hard day, and who told her things back. He never pushed. He had understood from the first that whatever had broken her had broken something specific, the capacity to be owned, and he never once tried to own her, and it was precisely that restraint that let the frozen thing in her chest begin, very slowly, to thaw. It was Cassian who first said the word aloud that they had both been circling. They were on the cliff at Saltmere in the last light, watching a Halloway grain ship beat up the coast toward the north, and Seraphine had just finished reading him the latest intelligence, the border war worsening, the granaries empty, the old lords muttering, and now a new and darker line. Lord Malrek Ashcroft had begun quietly buying loyalty among the palace guard, and the king had taken ill, a slow, wasting sickness his physicians could not name. "It's begun," Seraphine said, and there was no triumph in it, only a cold recognition. "He's poisoning Kaelin, the same way the mines poisoned your harbour. Slow, deniable, silver in the blood, so that when the king dies, the wolves will call it a curse or a weakness, and not a murder. And the moment Kaelin's gone, Malrek puts his grandchild on the throne with himself as regent, and the north belongs to the man who owns the silver." Cassian was quiet a long time. Then he said, "You could let it happen." She turned to look at him, and he met her eyes steadily, not accusing, just laying the truth on the table the way he laid everything, plainly. "He threw you to the wolves in front of his whole court, announced another woman's child as his heir, and called you barren, called you a wound. You owe him nothing. You could sit up here on your cliff and let Malrek finish him, and the man who broke you would die, knowing he'd been played for a fool, and no one would ever blame you, because no one down here even knows you were ever a queen. You could have your reckoning without lifting a finger." And Seraphine looked out at the north for a long moment, at the grain ship carrying food to a kingdom that had cast her out, and she found, testing herself honestly, that a part of her wanted exactly that, wanted to watch it all burn from a safe distance, wanted Cailan to feel in his last poisoned hours the full weight of the woman he had thrown away. It was a real temptation, and she did not pretend otherwise. "No," she said at last, and she surprised herself with how certain it was. "Not because I've forgiven him. I haven't, and I won't. But this stopped being about Cailan the moment I read Odessa's letter. There are 40,000 people in the north, Cassian. The servants who saved my life with their own copper. The border clans I bled in the mud to keep from war. Odessa. If Malrek takes that throne, he'll bleed them all the way his mines bled Rackford. Slow and deniable and forever. I didn't spend a year learning to cure a poisoned harbor so I could stand on a cliff and watch a man poison a kingdom." She paused, and something hardened in her voice. Something that made Cassian understand he was no longer talking to the Saltmere healer, but to the strategist who had once held a whole court together with her invisible hands. "And there's this. If I let Malrek win, then leaving Raven Moor was just running away. But if I go back, not as a fugitive, not as a discarded wife, but as the one person alive who can see the whole trap and spring it, then leaving was the first move in the longest game any of them have ever played. Cailan doesn't get to be my ending. I get to be his reckoning. There's a difference." Cassian looked at her, and then he did something he had never done in all their months of partnership. He reached out and took her hand, briefly, and pressed it, and let it go. "Then we don't do it alone," he said. "My ships, your web, the Vane trading house, the free ports. If we're going north to break a Silver Lord, we go with everything." And Seraphine, standing on the cliff that was hers alone, above the sea she had healed, felt the last of the frozen thing in her chest crack and fall away. And what was underneath was not the wound, and was not the rage, but something clean and whole, and hers. And it was the certainty that she was, at long last, ready to go home. The plan was patient, and it was surgical, and it was built the way Seraphine built everything, not with a roar, but with 100 quiet indispensabilities, laid so precisely that when the moment came, the trap would spring itself. She did not ride north with an army. She had no army, and armies were exactly the kind of force that Malrek Ashcroft, with his bought guards and his poisoned king, was prepared to counter. Instead, she sent letters, and she sent ships, and she sent, most of all, the one thing the North was starving for and could not refuse. Grain. The eastern marches had closed their granaries to Raven Moor, out of contempt for a king who discarded a beloved Luna. But they had never closed them to the Saltmere healer, whose physicians had trained their midwives, and whose engineers had cleaned their wells. And when Seraphine's agents came quietly offering a river of southern grain to feed the starving north, the marches opened their gates. But the grain did not flow to Cailan's court. That was the whole genius of it. It flowed to the people directly, to the border clans, to the villages, to the servants' halls of Raven Moor itself, carried in on Cassian's ships and distributed by the invisible network of the discarded, so that within a single month the 40,000 hungry souls of the North learned that their salvation came not from the crown that had failed them, but from a mysterious benefactor in the South, a woman with no name and endless mercy. And the loyalty of a starving people is the deepest current in any kingdom, deeper than any throne. Seraphine was buying the ground beneath Malrek's feet, quietly, one loaf at a time, and Malrek, watching for armies, never saw the bread. And then, when the ground was hers, she made herself known, but only to one person, and it was the person the whole plan turned on. Odessa Brine received a second letter, and this one did not ask her to run. It asked her to open a door. Because Calen Thorne was dying, slowly and terribly, of a wasting sickness his physicians could not name, and no physician in the north could name it, because none of them had spent 3 years treating silver poisoning in wolves, and the only healer in all the territories who could recognize what Malrek was doing to the king, could prove it, and could reverse it, was the very woman Calen had thrown into the rain. This was the exquisite architecture of the reckoning that Seraphine had built, and that even Cassian had not fully grasped until she laid it out. She would not go north to watch Calen die, and she would not go north to kill him. She would go north to save his life, because saving his life was the one move on the board that Malrek Ashcroft could not survive. If the king recovered, the regency evaporated. If a healer could prove the poison, the murder became treason. And if that healer was Seraphine Vane, the discarded Luna, returning not in vengeance, but in mercy to save the very man who had ruined her, then every soul in the north would understand in a single stroke exactly which of the 2 women in this story had ever been worthy of a crown. It was mercy as dominance, the sharpest weapon she owned, and she would wield it in the great hall of Raven Moor, before the same court that had once applauded her humiliation. She rode north at the head of a small party, as the first autumn frost silvered the passes, Cassian at her side, 3 of her physicians, and a strong box of documents that Cassian's Halloway lawyers had spent the summer assembling, deeds and ledgers and sworn testimonies tracing the silver from Malrek's mines to the poisoned dam to the wasting sickness in the king's blood, a paper checkmate more lethal than any blade. She wore no crown and no finery. She wore the plain dark wool of a physician and the signet ring of the Vane line. And she came into the north not as a queen reclaiming a throne, but as the only healer who could save a dying king. And word of her coming ran ahead of her through the network of the fed and the grateful, so that when she reached the gates of Raven Moor, the crowd that gathered was not hostile, but hushed, because half of them owed their winter's bread to a benefactor whose name they were only now beginning to learn. The great black palace rose before her exactly as it had sunk behind her a year ago, and she felt, riding through its gates, not the old dread, but a strange, still calm, the calm of a physician approaching a wound she already knows how to close. Odessa met her in the courtyard, older and thinner, but with the same missing-nothing eyes, and the 2 women embraced without a word, and then Odessa stepped back and looked at what Seraphine had become. The straight spine, the clear gaze, the quiet, unbreakable authority, and the old woman's face crumpled and reformed into fierce pride. "You did it," she whispered. "You rose so high the whole north has to look up." Seraphine took her hand. "Take me to him," she said. "It's time for the reckoning." The king's chamber stank of sickness and silver and fear. Calen Thorne lay in the great bed where Seraphine had once nursed him through the grey-water poisoning, and he was a ruin of the man who had smiled over another woman's belly a year ago. Grey-skinned, wasted, his black hair gone brittle, his hands trembling on the coverlet, the mate bond that connected them long dead, but the memory of it still able to twist in her chest at the sight of him, brought so low. Vivian sat by the window with her infant son in her arms, and she had aged a decade in a year, her beauty gone thin and frightened, because she had begun, too late, to understand what her father intended for a king who had outlived his usefulness, and to fear what he intended for a daughter who had served hers. And standing at the foot of the bed, tall and composed and utterly in command, was Lord Malrek Ashcroft, Master of the Silver, architect of the whole Slow murder, and he turned as the door opened and saw a plain-dressed woman he did not recognize enter with a physician's satchel, and his first words were the last easy words he would ever speak in that palace. "Ah, the southern healer. Good. Examine him by all means. Though I fear you'll find, as all the others have, that this is a curse beyond any medicine. A wolf king's line running out, as the moon decrees." He said it smoothly, laying the false story in place, and Seraphine looked at him, this man who had removed her from the board with such elegant cruelty and never once learned her face, and she felt the whole year rise up behind her eyes and settle into a single cold point of focus. "It's not a curse," she said, and set down her satchel and did not look away from him. "It's silver. Argent tailings from a poisoned water source, administered slowly over months, accumulating in the blood until the body wastes. I've seen it before. I spent 3 years treating it in this very palace." Something flickered in Malrek's composure, the first hairline crack. "And who," he said more sharply, "are you to make such a claim?" Seraphine reached up, and she pulled loose the plain cloth that had bound her hair for the road, and she let it fall, and she raised her face fully into the light of the chamber for the first time, and she watched the recognition detonate across 3 faces at once. Vivienne made a small broken sound and clutched her child. Calen, on the bed, forced his ruined eyes open and breathed a name he had not let himself say in a year. "Seraphine," in a voice like a man seeing the sun after a long burial. And Malrek Ashcroft's face went, for one exquisite instant, absolutely white, because the master strategist understood in a single heartbeat that the one variable he had removed from the board had walked back onto it, holding the only card that could destroy him. "I am Seraphine Vane," she said, into the ringing silence. "Daughter of the Vane physicians, Luna of Nightfell that was, and the healer who is going to save your king's life. And when he wakes, because he will wake, he is going to want to know exactly whose silver has been in his blood." She let that land. Then, quieter, the blade sliding home. "You built this trap so carefully, my lord. You even had the king remove the one person clever enough to see it. But you made one mistake. You should have made sure I was dead." Malrek Ashcroft did not become master of the silver holdings by panicking, and he did not panic now. He recovered his composure in the space of 2 breaths and reached for the only weapon a man like him ever truly trusts, which is the assumption that everyone can be commanded, bought, or broken. "You've done well for yourself, girl," he said, and his voice had gone silken and low, the voice of a man offering terms. "A ruin and a fishing village, they tell me. Charming. But you are a long way from your cliff, and you are standing in a palace full of my guards, making wild accusations about a grief-stricken lord whose only crime is caring for a dying friend. Withdraw them. Treat the king if you can. I doubt you can. And I will be generous. A physician of your evident skill could have a very comfortable life under the new regency. Or you can persist in this fantasy and discover how quickly a nameless southern healer can vanish from a palace where no one of importance knows her face. It was the same move Calen had made a year ago, the same trap Odessa had warned her against, the offer of charity that turns acceptance into ownership, the generosity that is a leash, and Seraphine recognized it, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth, because Malrek had just walked into the exact center of the ground she had spent a year preparing. "That doesn't work on me anymore," she said. "The commanding, the buying, the threatening. I spent 3 years in this palace, learning that a king's word is only as strong as the 1,000 hands that carry it out, and you've spent a year forgetting it. So let me tell you what's actually standing in this room, Lord Malrek, because you've miscounted. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that the wronged party speaks least and lands hardest. You think this palace is full of your guards. Half of them were fed this winter by grain that came in on my ships, distributed by servants who serve me before they serve you, because I learned their names when you never bothered. You think no one of importance knows my face. Every border lord in the north knows that the Saltmere healer kept their children from starving, and they learned an hour ago that the Saltmere healer is the Luna this crown threw into the rain. You think I came here alone. She gestured, and Cassian stepped forward with the strong box and set it on the table and opened it. Deeds to your minds, assays of the tailings, the chain of custody of the water that poisoned this town's springs, and, I will prove, this king's blood, sworn testimony from 3 physicians, and 1 very old and very observant servant who heard you, in this palace, describe your intention to end the Thorn line and rule through your grandchild. It's all copied. It's all in Halloway, and it's all timed to be read aloud in every free port and border hall in the north the moment I fail to send word that I am safe. She closed the strongbox. You built the gallows, my lord. I've spent a year buying the lumber. The only question left is whether you climb the steps quietly or whether the whole north watches you dragged up them. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Malrek's eyes flicked to the door, to the window, to the guards he had thought were his, and Seraphine watched the arithmetic run behind them and watched it come up empty, because she had done the thing that men like Malrek never expect their victims to do. She had not come to fight him on his ground, with force against force, where his silver and his guards and his ruthlessness gave him every advantage. She had spent a year building an entirely different board, and had lured him onto it without his ever knowing the game had moved. And now he stood on ground that was hers from the granaries to the guard posts to the courts of law, and there was no command that could shift it, and no coin that could buy it, and no threat that could break it. You can't prove the poison, he said, but the silk had gone out of his voice, and it came out as something close to a question. I can, Seraphine said. That's what a physician who's treated silver poisoning for 3 years can do that your bought doctors can't. I can prove it in the king's blood before he's even conscious to accuse you, and I'm going to. She turned away from him then. The walk away, the ultimate dismissal, turning her back on the most dangerous man in the north as though he were already finished, because in every way that mattered he was. And she crossed to the great bed and knelt beside the dying king and opened her satchel and began, with steady and merciful hands, to save the life of the man who had destroyed hers. It took 9 days. 9 days of collating tinctures and clean water, and the slow patient work of drawing silver out of a wolf's poisoned blood, work that Seraphine did herself, at the bedside, hour after hour, while Cassian's men quietly secured the palace, and the border lords rode in one by one to see with their own eyes that the Saltmere healer had returned, and the truth of what had been done to their king. Malrek Ashcroft was placed under guard on the 2nd day, when the first assay came back, and the captain of the guard, a man whose sister Seraphine had once saved from childbed fever, chose his loyalty and made his choice known. Vivian was not imprisoned. Seraphine gave that order herself, over the objections of half the court, because Vivian with her infant son had become the clearest living proof of her father's treason, and the most broken of his instruments, and Seraphine had learned that mercy, precisely applied, is a form of dominance that no cruelty can match. On the 9th day, in the grey light before dawn, Calen Thorne opened his eyes, and they were clear. He knew her at once. He lay looking at her in the thin light, the ruin of the man who had called her barren, and she saw the whole year cross his face, the fever dreams in which he must have called for her, the slow horror of understanding what he had thrown away, the impossible fact of her hands on his brow again, after everything. "You came back," he said, and his voice broke on it. "After what I did. After what I said to you, in front of them all, you came back and you saved me." Seraphine set down the cloth she had been cooling his forehead with, and she looked at him, and she felt, testing herself honestly one last time, that the old wound was there, but that it no longer ruled her, that she could look at the face of the man who had severed the bond in front of 200 people and feel nothing that could move her hand. "I didn't come back for you," she said, and it was not cruel, only true. "I came back for them, for the servants who saved my life with their own copper when you were busy celebrating, for the border clans I bled in the mud to protect while you decided I was a wound, for the 40,000 people your vanity nearly sold to the man who was poisoning you in your own bed. You were never the point, Calen. You were just the thing standing in the way." He closed his eyes, and a tear slid down into his brittle hair, and he did not argue, because there was nothing to argue. "I made the worst mistake a king can make," he said. "I mistook loyalty for weakness and cleverness for a threat. I had the strongest Luna the North has ever seen, and I threw her into the rain because a man showed me an easier heir. Come back." He opened his eyes, and there was desperation in them now, the desperation of a man watching the sun set on everything he'd squandered. Not as a favor, as a right. "Take the crown back. Take your place. I'll set Vivienne aside, "No," Seraphine said, and it was gentle, and it was absolute, and it closed the door forever. "You still don't understand, even now. You think a crown is a thing you can give me back, the way you gave it and took it before, as though my worth were something that lived in your hands. It never did. I built a harbor from a ruin. I cured a poisoned sea. I fed your kingdom when you couldn't, and I unmade the trap you walked me into, and I did every bit of it without a crown, without a king, without a bond, on a cliff at the edge of the world where nobody knew my name, and I had to earn it all again, from nothing. I don't want the throne of Nightfell, Calen. I want you to understand, every day for the rest of your reign, that everything holding your kingdom together right now, the grain, the peace, the very blood in your veins, you owe to the woman you called barren in front of your court. That's not something I need to sit on a throne to collect. I already have it. That is the reckoning." She rose. She had one more thing to do, and it was the piece of the whole design she had cared about most, and she did it not for the court, and not for Calen, but for the old woman waiting in the servants' hall below. She had Odessa Brine brought up to the great hall of Ravenmoor, the same hall where a year ago a Luna had been discarded in front of 200 souls, and before the assembled court, the border lords, the physicians, the guards who had chosen truth, the servants crowded 3 deep in the doorways. Seraphine Vane stood at the head of the room where she had once been humiliated, and she did not take the throne. She stood beside it, on the level ground, where she had always done her truest work. "I am not staying," she told them, and a murmur of dismay ran through the hall, and she let it settle. "The South is my home now, and there is a harbor waiting for me, and a partnership, and a life I built with my own 2 hands that no man in this room gave me, and no man can take away. But before I go, I am going to tell you the truth of the last year, all of it. so that no crier can bend it, and no lord can bury it." And she did. She told them of Malrek's design, and the poisoned silver, and the child placed like a pawn. She told them of the servants, copper, and the grain on southern ships. She told them, plainly and without heat, what had been done to her in that hall a year ago, and what she had built in exile. And the court listened in a silence that was, by the end, something like awe, because they were hearing not a wronged woman's grievance, but a strategist's after-action report on a war they had not even known was being fought over their heads. A war she had won without their ever seeing a sword. Malrek Ashcroft was tried before the border lords within the month, and the paper checkmate Cassian's lawyers had built held exactly as designed. The silver in the king's blood, the assays of the mines, the testimony of an old servant who had hidden in the passages and remembered every word. There was no command that could shift it, and no coin that could buy the free ports that held the copies, and the master of the silver, who had played a longer game than anyone and lost it to a woman he never bothered to learn the face of, was stripped of his holdings and exiled beyond the northern passes, his mines seized, and at Seraphine's specific instruction, sealed and cleansed by the very engineers who had cured Rackford's harbour, so that the poison that had begun the whole story could poison nothing else. Vivian Ashcroft left the palace quietly before the trial ended, with her infant son and a small sum that Seraphine had arranged without telling anyone, and she came to the courtyard in the grey dawn of her leaving to find the woman she had betrayed already there, saddling a plain brown horse for the road south. The two women who had once braided each other's hair looked at each other across the cold stones, and there was a long silence. And then Vivian said, in a voice worn down to nothing, "I told myself you'd be fine. I told myself you were strong enough to land on your feet, so it wasn't really cruelty, letting them send you away. I told myself a lot of things." Seraphine tightened the girth on the saddle and did not stop working. "You were his instrument," she said. "You were frightened of your father and dazzled by a king, and you made yourself believe a lie because the truth was unbearable. I understand it. I even, in some way I can't explain, forgive it. But understanding and forgiveness aren't the same as forgetting, Vivienne, and they're not the same as trust, and you and I are never going to braid each other's hair again." Vivian's eyes filled. "Then why the money? Why arrange a place for me, after everything?" And Seraphine finally turned and looked at her, and there was nothing cruel in her face, only the settled clarity of a woman who had learned the true shape of her own strength. "Because your son didn't choose any of this," she said. "And because the difference between me and your father is that I don't hurt children to win. Go raise him somewhere the silver never touched. Raise him to be nothing like the men who made you. That's the only revenge I have any interest in taking on you." And with that, Seraphine swung up into the saddle, and Vivian stepped back, and the woman who had once been placed like a pawn watched the woman she had wronged ride out through the gates of Ravenmoor for the second and final time. But this time there was no rain, and there was no silence, because the whole of the servants' hall had emptied into the courtyard to see her go, and Odessa Brine stood at the front of them, with her cracked, strong hands pressed to her mouth, and as the plain brown horse passed beneath the great arch, the invisible kingdom beneath the kingdom lifted its voice in something that was not applause but a great low murmur of farewell, the sound a people make for the one who fed them. Cassian fell in beside her at the crest of the northern pass, and they rode south together toward the sea, toward the cliff that was hers, toward the harbour she had raised from poison and the life she had built from nothing, and she did not look back at the black palace sinking behind her, because there was nothing left in it that she needed. She had ridden out of it a year ago with a satchel, a ring, a deed, and a vow. She was riding home now with a partnership, a federation, a kingdom in her debt, and the one thing Ravenmoor could never have given her, the certainty, bone deep and unbreakable, that she had never been the wound. She had always been the cure. So remember this, whoever you are, wherever you are hearing it, when the people who are supposed to hold you sever the bond and call it your failing, do not scream, and do not beg, and do not accept the charity that comes dressed as mercy. Walk out into the rain. Find the one door in the world that only you have the key to, and go build something so true and so needed that one day, without ever lifting a sword, you rise so high, the whole world that discarded you has to look up just to find your face.